They didn't mean to open the garage that night. That's the part no one ever talks about. It wasn't some dramatic decision. No flashlight cutting through darkness. No ominous music swelling in the background. Just a tired security supervisor, a property manager who wanted to lock up, and a single question that wouldn't go away. Why was the garage still sealed? Think about that for a second. When a wealthy, high-profile Hollywood figure dies suddenly, every room gets touched. Bedrooms, offices, ghost houses, closets, safes. But garages? Garages are funny places. They're treated like storage. Afterthoughts. Places where time piles up quietly. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And this one hadn't been opened in years. What would you expect to find in a legendary filmmaker's garage? Old awards gathering dust? Vintage cars? Boxes of scripts? Maybe props from famous movies? That's what everyone assumed. They were wrong. Before we go any further, let me ask you something directly. If you lived next door to someone you thought you knew, someone whose face appeared on talk shows, whose voice echoed through movie theaters, whose name was synonymous with laughter, power, and influence, would you believe they could be hiding something monstrous just feet away from where they slept? Most people wouldn't. That assumption is exactly how this story begins. Because on the outside, everything about this estate screamed legacy, success, stability, a long career built on storytelling, satire, and social commentary. The kind of life people envy from a distance. But behind the gates, behind the hedges, behind a garage door that hadn't lifted in years, a different story was waiting. And it was impatient. The call that triggered everything came late on a Sunday night. Not a scream, not a confession, just an alert. Motion detected where there shouldn't have been any. Security shrugged it off at first. Old sensors malfunction all the time, especially in large properties, especially in garages no one uses. But then it happened again, and again. Here's where things get strange. Every other structure on the property showed normal activity logs. The main house, the guest house, the perimeter, everything lined up, except the garage. No recent entries, no exits, no access codes logged, just movement. How does something move in a place no one enters? Ask yourself that. That question alone should have raised alarms. Instead, it raised curiosity. The property manager arrived with keys that hadn't been touched in years. Dust caked the handle. Cobwebs stretched across the door frame like nature itself was trying to keep something sealed. One of the security guards joked nervously, asking if they were about to find a forgotten sports car worth millions. No one laughed. The air felt wrong. Have you ever been somewhere that felt heavy before anything actually happened? That kind of silence that presses against your ears? That was the garage. The door didn't open smoothly. It resisted, like it didn't want to be disturbed. When it finally lifted, just a few inches at first, the smell hit them. Not gasoline, not oil, something organic, something unmistakably wrong. People argue about this part later. About who froze first, about who took the step back, about who whispered, "That's not normal." What matters is this: no one stepped forward. Because instinct took over. Human instinct doesn't need evidence. It doesn't need confirmation. It just knows when something has gone horribly off course. The door was raised fully, and that's when the room revealed itself. Not cars, not boxes, not memorabilia. Shapes. Covered. Wrapped. Stacked in ways that didn't make sense for storage. Too deliberate. Too careful. Too final. How many seconds do you think it takes for the brain to register that something isn't an object, but a body? 1 second? 2. According to later testimony, it took longer. Much longer. Because denial is powerful. Because the mind tries to protect itself. But once the truth settled in, once the smell and the shapes and the silence aligned into something undeniable, panic replaced curiosity. Phones came out, then went back into pockets. No one wanted to be the first to document what they were seeing. Why? Because some things feel like they shouldn't be recorded. They feel like boundaries. They feel like secrets that fight back. One of the guards stumbled backward and nearly fell. Another vomited outside. The property manager kept repeating the same sentence under his breath. This isn't possible. This isn't possible. But it was. And it had been waiting. Here's the part that makes this story matter right now. Not the bodies. Not the shock. Not even the discovery. It's the timing. Because earlier that same day, The estate had already become the center of quiet chaos. Police activity, unmarked cars, a sense that something tragic had already occurred. But no one, not law enforcement, not staff, not family, expected this. Ask yourself why. Why would something this significant remain untouched? Why would an entire structure on a multi-million-dollar estate go overlooked? And more importantly, who wanted it that way? As word spread internally, one name kept coming up. Not the filmmaker, not his spouse, someone else. Someone who lived just steps away, but always slightly apart. Someone whose presence on the property was described as both constant and invisible. The adult son, the one in the guest house, the one neighbors said they rarely saw, but often heard. The one whose routines didn't match the rest of the household. The one whose light stayed on long after everyone else went dark. Here's where the contradictions begin. Because outwardly, he appeared quiet, withdrawn, unassuming. But behind closed doors, something wasn't lining up. Neighbors would later say they heard late-night garage activity despite the doors never opening. Staff would admit they were instructed never to enter that building. Security logs showed edits, not deletions. Edits. Someone had been curating what was seen, and what wasn't. Think about the psychology of that. If you were hiding something, would you erase evidence? Or would you reshape it? That choice alone tells you this wasn't impulsive. It was managed, controlled, planned. The discovery of the garage changed everything. Because suddenly, the story wasn't just about a tragic death. It was about time. About how long this had been happening. About how many people had unknowingly walked past that door. About how close the truth had always been. And about what else might still be hidden. As police sealed off the area, one investigator reportedly paused at the threshold, staring into the garage longer than anyone else. When asked later why, he said something chilling. This room wasn't meant to be found all at once. Let that sink in. Not meant to be found all at once. Which raises the most terrifying question of all. If this was only one room, what was the rest of the house keeping quiet? Because as investigators began tracing movements, timelines, and relationships, one unsettling possibility emerged. The garage might not have been the beginning. It might have been the overflow. And what came next would force everyone to re-examine the people they thought they understood and the signs they chose to ignore. What most people don't realize is that discoveries like this don't explode into chaos right away. They simmer. They sit. They wait for context. And while the garage was being sealed, while yellow tape cut across the driveway like a warning scar, the rest of the property remained eerily untouched. Almost respectful. As if the house itself didn't yet know what it had been dragged into. Inside, clocks kept ticking. Lights stayed on. The guest house window still glowed. Let me ask you something. If you knew something terrible had just been uncovered steps from where you lived, would you stay put? Or would you disappear? Because the person in the guest house didn't move. Not immediately. And that detail would later haunt investigators. The adult son, quiet, rarely seen, described by staff as polite but distant, was still inside when the garage discovery was reported up the chain. No attempt to leave. No frantic phone calls. No visible panic. That's not normal. People react when the ground beneath them shifts. Even innocent people. Especially innocent people. But this reaction, or lack of one, stood out. An officer assigned to keep eyes on the guest house would later say the same thing again and again. He looked like someone waiting for a bus. Waiting. Not shocked. Not confused. Waiting. While law enforcement debated jurisdiction and procedure, while supervisors arrived and whispered urgently into radios, something else was happening behind the scenes. Phones were ringing. Names were being dropped. Legal teams were mobilizing before anyone outside the gates even knew there was a story. That's how fast power moves when it senses exposure. You see, this wasn't just any estate. It belonged to someone whose career spanned decades. Someone whose friends included politicians, media executives, activists, actors. Someone whose public image was built on humor, moral conviction, and storytelling that claimed to expose uncomfortable truths. Irony doesn't even begin to cover it. Because now, the uncomfortable truth was knocking from inside the garage. As detectives began their initial walkthroughs, a troubling pattern emerged. Nothing in the garage looked rushed. Think about that. If this were panic-driven, there would be chaos, sloppiness, evidence of desperation. Instead, everything appeared methodical, measured, Intentional. And that raised a new question. Who had the time to do this? Who had access? Who had privacy? And who had motive? The answer, uncomfortably, kept circling back to the same person. The one who lived just far enough away to be separate. The one who knew the property well enough to exploit blind spots. The one who never had to explain why he was on the grounds. The son. But here's where the story refuses to stay simple. Because when detectives began reviewing the family's history, they didn't find what they expected. No public scandals. No violent past. No dramatic falling outs splashed across headlines. What they found instead was silence. Years of it. A slow withdrawal from social life. Canceled events. Missed holidays. Friends who drifted away without explanation. Staff turnover that suddenly made sense in hindsight. Ask yourself this. When multiple people leave a workplace quietly, one by one, without complaint, what does that usually mean? It means they saw something they didn't want to fight, or something they were told not to talk about. Former employees would later describe an unspoken rule. The garage was off limits. Not locked because of valuables. Locked because of instructions. And those instructions didn't come from the head of the household. They came from the guest house, from the son. At first, no one questioned it. He was family. He had authority by proximity. And in wealthy households, boundaries are strange things. They bend easily when comfort is at stake. That's how anomalies become routine. That's how red flags turn invisible. As the night wore on, investigators expanded their search. And that's when the contradictions began stacking up. Security footage showed gaps, not blackouts, selective absences, as if someone knew exactly which moments to erase without raising suspicion. Financial records showed unexplained expenditures tied to storage supplies, chemical purchases that didn't align with any legitimate household need. And then there were the neighbors, people who had waved politely for years, people who had admired the estate from behind hedges and gates. They started talking. One mentioned strange late-night noises that sounded metallic, rhythmic, deliberate. Another recalled seeing vehicles pull into the driveway and leave without ever stopping at the main house. A third remembered something that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. The garage lights. They were never supposed to be on. Yet they were. Often. Late. Alone. Why would anyone spend that much time in a place meant for storage? Unless it wasn't storage. Unless it was something else entirely. As dawn approached, the estate transformed. Media vans began circling. Rumors leaked before facts could catch up. And inside the house, a single moment marked the point of no return. Detectives entered the guest house. And what they found there didn't contradict the garage. It complemented it. Not with gore. Not with spectacle. But with planning. Notes. Schedules. A calendar that wasn't about dates. It was about intervals. Time between actions. Time between movements. Time between disappearances. One investigator reportedly closed the notebook and said quietly, "This isn't impulsive. This is ritual." Ritual. That word changes everything. Because rituals imply repetition. And repetition implies history. Which brings us back to the garage. Back to the question no one wanted to ask out loud. How long had this been going on? And how many times had people unknowingly been close enough to stop it? The sun rose over the estate like it always had. Birds sang. Traffic hummed. Life continued outside the gates. But inside, the story was unraveling faster than anyone could contain it. Because the garage wasn't just a discovery. It was a message. A final accumulation of things that were never supposed to be found together. And as investigators prepared to transport evidence out of the property, one final detail stopped them cold. Behind a false wall, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was another door. Smaller, sealed, locked from the inside, and labeled with a single handwritten word. What does a door labeled "next" even mean? Think about that before we go any further. Not exit, not storage, not tools. Next, as if whatever came before was only a step. As if what had already been found wasn't the end, but part of a sequence. That single word changed the temperature of the room. Investigators didn't rush it. They couldn't. Doors like that don't get opened casually. Not after what had already been uncovered. Not when the implications were spiraling faster than anyone could document them. One officer reportedly asked the question no one else wanted to voice. Next compared to what? Silence answered him. Because suddenly, the garage wasn't just a place. It was a timeline. And timelines imply progression. Which brings us to the first real chapter of this story. The one nobody expected to exist. The hidden structure of the property. On paper, the estate was straightforward. Main house, guest house, garage, grounds. That's what the permits showed. That's what the blueprints claimed. But as every investigator knows, what's on paper and what exists in reality are often two very different things, especially when money, privacy, and influence intersect. Here's something most people don't realize. High-end estates are renovated constantly, quietly. Walls move, rooms disappear, spaces get redefined without triggering inspections. And when the owner has connections, paperwork tends to follow intent rather than fact. This property was no exception. As the door marked "Next" was photographed and cataloged, a structural specialist was brought in. Not because they expected secret tunnels or cinematic surprises, but because the layout no longer made sense. Square footage was missing. Not a little, a lot. Entire sections of the property's interior volume didn't align with the external footprint. Where did that space go? That question alone reframed the entire investigation. Because now it wasn't just about what was found. It was about what wasn't. The specialist traced wall thicknesses, ceiling heights, and floor gradients. He compared renovations over the years. Small changes that, individually, meant nothing. Together, they told a different story. Rooms had been layered over older rooms. Access points sealed. Utility lines rerouted with surgical precision. Someone had been shaping this house for a long time. And whoever did it understood structure, understood concealment, understood patience. Ask yourself this. Who has the motivation to redesign a space not for comfort, but for control? The answer wasn't the public figure everyone knew. It was someone else. Someone with time. Someone without scrutiny. Someone whose presence was assumed, not questioned. The guest house was never just a guest house. Let's talk about that guest house. Because on the surface, it looked harmless. A place for independence, privacy, a grown child living nearby. But as investigators moved through it again, slower this time, something felt off. There were no personal touches, no photos, no memorabilia, no sense of life. It wasn't a home. It was a station, a place to pass through, not to settle in. Drawers were organized too neatly. Shelves held items grouped by function, not sentiment. This wasn't someone living. This was someone preparing. And then there were the notebooks. Not journals. Logs. Dates without names. Times without descriptions. Just marks. Intervals. Pauses. Returns. Why would someone track time so obsessively? Unless time was the most important variable. Investigators began cross-referencing these logs with external data. Missing persons reports. Unexplained absences. Patterns that had never been connected before. At first, nothing lined up. Different cities. Different years. Different circumstances. But then someone noticed something chilling. The gaps between entries were consistent. Not random. Consistent. Which meant whatever these entries represented followed a schedule. And schedules imply planning. Which implies intent. The first theory, and why it failed. The initial theory was obvious. A disturbed individual acting alone. But that theory fell apart almost immediately. Because acting alone doesn't explain infrastructure. Acting alone doesn't explain years of preparation. Acting alone doesn't explain how no one noticed. Someone had to look the other way. Someone had to dismiss concerns. Someone had to accept explanations that didn't make sense. And when investigators began interviewing staff, the pattern emerged. Every concern raised about the garage had been redirected. Not denied. Redirected. Someone always stepped in to smooth things over. Someone always reframed the issue. Someone always reminded them who they worked for. Here's the contradiction. That someone was never the head of the household. It was the son. He had authority without title, influence without explanation, and access without oversight. When asked why, former staff members gave the same answer. That's just how it was. Have you ever noticed how dangerous that phrase is? That's just how it was. It ends questions. It kills curiosity. It creates blind spots. And blind spots are where things hide. The second door. Back in the garage, the door labeled "Next" finally opened. Not dramatically. Slowly. Carefully. As if everyone involved understood that once it was opened, there would be no pretending this was just an anomaly. What lay beyond wasn't shocking in the way people expect. No spectacle. No immediate horror. Just space. A long, narrow corridor. soundproofed, climate-controlled, and intentionally they formed a path from the garage corridor toward the main house, toward the heart of the structure. That's when the house stopped feeling passive, because paths imply movement, and movement implies use. One investigator muttered something under his breath that later appeared in an internal memo. This place wasn't hiding things from us. It was guiding them. Guiding. Let that word sit for a moment. Because houses don't guide unless someone designed them to. The first wall came down. They didn't rush demolition. They didn't swing hammers or tear through drywall like television crews. They cut. Cleanly. Carefully. And when the first section of wall came away, there was no dramatic reveal. Just another wall. Older. Different material. Different era. A wall behind a wall. Why would anyone do that? Renovation experts will tell you, sometimes it's cheaper to build over something than remove it. But cheaper doesn't mean smarter. And it definitely doesn't mean innocent. Behind that wall was a narrow space. Not wide enough to walk comfortably, but wide enough to move through sideways. And along the interior surface, scratches, at shoulder height, repeated, parallel, too deliberate to be construction marks, too consistent to be accidental. Ask yourself this. What would cause repeated shoulder-level contact in a space no one is supposed to enter? The answer wasn't something investigators wanted to say out loud, so they didn't. Instead, they kept moving. The house had layers. Once the first hidden space was discovered, others followed. Like peeling back skin, each layer older than the last, each one more deliberate, each one telling the same story from a different angle. This house hadn't been renovated. It had been adapted, repurposed, weaponized. Rooms had been resized subtly, doors repositioned, sightlines altered. From the inside, nothing looked unusual. From above, it was a maze. And at the center of that maze was something chillingly consistent. Control points. Places where movement could be observed without being seen. Vents that weren't for air. Panels that weren't for access. Corners that made no sense unless you were standing somewhere else. Watching. That realization hit the team hard. Because it reframed the entire timeline. If the house was designed for observation, then the garage wasn't just a final destination. It was a culmination. Which meant everything before it mattered more. The guest house revisited. With fresh eyes, the guest house suddenly looked different. Not emptier. More intentional. The lack of decoration was an absence. It was discipline. Nothing personal. Nothing distracting. Nothing that could be used against the occupant. Even the bed placement was wrong. Centered for visibility, not comfort. Aligned with a window that faced the main house at a specific angle. An angle that, when cross-referenced with internal layouts, lined up with something no one had noticed before. A line of sight. From guest house, through a hidden vent, into the main house. Specifically, one room, the same room, over and over again. The room where everything began and ended. Why that room? Why not another? Why obsess over a single space when the house was full of them? That question would take days to answer. And when the answer came, it made the garage feel almost merciful by comparison. The sun's silence. Throughout all of this, the sun said very little. That silence wasn't defiance. It was strategy. He answered questions directly, calmly, without contradiction. He didn't volunteer information. He didn't deny access. He didn't react when new discoveries were made. And that unnerved everyone. Because people crack when lies are exposed. They fidget. They rationalize. They push back. He did none of that. Instead, he watched, listened, waited. That same word again. Waiting. An investigator would later describe the feeling this way. It was like questioning someone who already knew the ending. That's a terrifying position to be in, because it flips the power dynamic. Suddenly, the person in custody doesn't feel contained. They feel ahead. The pattern emerges. By the third day, the pattern was undeniable. Every hidden space corresponded to a phase. Observation, preparation, containment, disposal. Think about that sequence. It's not random. It's not emotional. It's procedural, which means whoever designed this didn't just want secrecy. They wanted efficiency. And efficiency requires repetition. As the evidence map grew, one investigator pinned a note at the top of the board. If this is a system, it didn't start here. That note would become the quiet heartbeat of the investigation. Because if the system predated the house, then the house was just an upgrade. A refinement. An evolution. And that raised a new, deeply unsettling question. Where was the prototype? Where did this behavior begin before walls and corridors and garages existed to support it? The past starts speaking. Old addresses were pulled. Rental histories. Temporary residences. Short stays. Every place the son had lived in the last decade. And when those locations were mapped, something emerged that made seasoned investigators go quiet. Proximity. Each location was near something specific. Transit hubs. Hospitals. Event venues. Places where people pass through and disappear without friction. Coincidence? Once or twice, maybe. But repeatedly? No. That's design. And it suggested something even more disturbing. The house wasn't the origin of the behavior. It was the optimization of it. Which means everything found so far, everything, was practice. And as the investigation pivoted outward, away from the estate and into the past, one final discovery inside the house forced the team to stop and recalibrate. Hidden beneath a stairwell, a place no one had checked because it was assumed too small to matter, was a compartment. Inside it, a single item, wrapped, preserved, labeled, not with a name, not with a date, but with a number. And that number was not one. What does it mean when something is labeled with a number? And that number isn't the beginning? That question hung in the air longer than anyone wanted. Because numbering implies sequence, and sequence implies history. The small compartment beneath the stairwell shouldn't have existed. The architectural plans showed no void there, no allowance for storage, no reason for hollow space. Yet it was there, carved out deliberately, concealed expertly, and ignored for years because no one thought to question a place that seemed too insignificant to matter. That's the danger of assumptions. The item inside was wrapped with care, not hurried, not panicked, preserved. Who preserves something they regret? Nobody. You preserve something you intend to remember or reuse. The label that changed the investigation. The label was handwritten, precise, almost elegant. A single number, not accompanied by a date, not accompanied by a location, just a number. Investigators exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. Because if this item wasn't the first, then where was the first? And how many followed? The decision was made to halt further exploration of the house temporarily, not because they were done, but because they were suddenly very aware of the scale of what they might be dealing with. This wasn't a single incident. This wasn't a sudden break. This was accumulation. And accumulation suggests patience. Which brings us back to the son, because patience had always been his defining trait. A calm that no longer made sense. During questioning, the discovery of the numbered item was mentioned casually. Not as an accusation, not as a reveal, just as a fact. His reaction? Nothing. No flicker, no tightening of the jaw, no involuntary response. He didn't ask what number it was. He didn't ask what it referred to. He didn't ask where it was found. Instead, he asked something else. Did you catalog it correctly? That question froze the room. Because innocent people ask different questions. They ask why. They ask how. They ask what it means. They don't ask about procedure. Procedure implies familiarity, and familiarity implies repetition. An investigator later described that moment as the point where theory crossed into certainty. Because no one accidentally builds a system this complex. No one stumbles into this level of organization. This was learned behavior, refined behavior, practiced behavior. The map expands. Once the numbered item was logged, analysts began cross-referencing it against everything else. The logs, the intervals, the calendar without dates. Suddenly, those abstract markings began to align. Each number corresponded to a gap. Each gap corresponded to a period of time. And each period of time aligned with something that had once been dismissed as unrelated. A missing person report that went cold. A sudden move. A job left without explanation. A lease terminated early. You see how this works. When you look at events individually, they feel random. When you align them, they tell a story. And this story was not accidental. The son hadn't just lived quietly. He had moved strategically. He had inserted himself into environments where disappearance didn't trigger alarms. And when scrutiny grew too close, he relocated, not to hide, but to continue. The house was the final version. This is where the house takes on a new meaning. Because if the behavior existed long before the estate, then the estate wasn't the birthplace. It was the culmination. The place where everything he had learned could finally be implemented without compromise. privacy, resources, control, distance from scrutiny, and most importantly, time. Time to refine, time to organize, time to wait. Ask yourself this. What kind of person doesn't rush when they know discovery is inevitable? Someone who believes the system is stronger than the exposure. Someone who believes that even if one location is compromised, the framework survives. Which raises a terrifying possibility. What if the house wasn't unique? What if it was just the most advanced example? The prototype locations. Investigators began quietly revisiting the son's previous residences. Not with media, not with announcements. Discreetly, methodically. And in the first location, they found nothing, which almost fooled them into relief. Almost. Because in the second location, something subtle appeared. A wall that shouldn't have been thicker. A vent that didn't connect to airflow. A storage area that was never listed on any plan. Sound familiar? By the third location, the pattern was undeniable. Each place contained a simplified version of what was found in the estate. Less sophisticated, less concealed, but unmistakably related. Like early drafts of the same idea, which confirmed the worst-case scenario. This wasn't a single environment enabling behavior. This was behavior shaping environments. The silence of the past. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation wasn't what they found. It was who never spoke up. Neighbors remembered odd things, but dismissed them. Landlords remembered requests that felt strange but profitable. Employers remembered absences but didn't want confrontation. Everyone had noticed something. No one had connected it. Because each individual saw only a fragment. And fragments don't scream. They whisper. The house allowed those whispers to become screams. But only at the end. The item revisited. Back beneath the stairwell, the numbered item sat in evidence storage. Analysts examined it again. Not for what it was, but for why it mattered. Why preserve this one? Why label it? Why hide it somewhere so specific? The answer came unexpectedly. This item wasn't functional. It was symbolic. A marker. A reminder. Of the moment the system worked exactly as intended. The first success. That's why it wasn't number one. Because number one had been a failure. A lesson. A mistake. And this was when the process became repeatable. That realization sent a ripple through the team. Because it suggested something chilling. Learning curves. Adjustments. Optimization. These aren't concepts associated with accidents. They belong to design. The son's final statement of the day. At the end of a long day, one investigator asked a question that wasn't on the list. Why keep records at all? The son paused. Just once. Then answered. Because forgetting is inefficient. That sentence would later be replayed in courtrooms, documentaries, and private nightmares. Because it stripped away any remaining illusion of confusion or loss of control. This wasn't chaos. It was order. A private order that had finally collided with public reality. And as Chapter 2 draws to a close, we're left with a truth that's impossible to ignore. The house didn't create the monster. It revealed him. And now that the system had been exposed in one place, investigators were racing against a terrifying clock. Because systems like this don't exist in isolation. They evolve. They adapt. And sometimes, they survive their creators. What happens when a system built in silence suddenly realizes it's been seen? That's the question investigators were asking themselves as Chapter 3 began, because exposure doesn't end a process like this. It challenges it, and challenges force adaptation. The investigation shifts direction. Up until now, everything had pointed inward. The house, the garage, the guest house, the hidden spaces, the numbered item. All of it suggested a closed ecosystem. One person, one property, one long-running pattern finally collapsing under its own weight. But systems don't collapse that neatly. They sprawl. They branch. And when investigators stepped back and looked at the evidence as a whole, a disturbing realization emerged. This wasn't just about what had happened on the property. It was about where the logic of the system pointed next. Because systems are built with redundancy, fail-safes, continuity. And that meant one thing. The son hadn't put all his control in one place. He couldn't have. The moment everyone missed. There was a small detail buried in early reports that no one had paid much attention to. Not because it was unimportant, because it seemed harmless. A line item from a utility audit years earlier noted an unusual power draw at odd hours. Not spikes. Consistency. Low, steady usage. too regular to be accidental. At the time, it was attributed to climate control. Now, it meant something else. Because steady power usage implies occupancy, and occupancy implies activity. Even when no one is supposed to be there, investigators pulled utility records going back more than a decade. Not just for the estate. For every known residence associated with the sun, the pattern repeated. Different locations. Same rhythm. Always at night. Always off the books. Always just enough to stay invisible. Ask yourself something. If you wanted to operate without attracting attention, would you ever go dark? No. Going dark creates questions. Consistency blends in. That wasn't carelessness. That was experience. The secondary locations. Once the theory shifted, so did the search. Attention turned to places connected not by ownership, but by access. Storage units. Rented workspaces. Short-term leases. Commercial properties held through shell agreements. You'd be surprised how many places someone can use without ever putting their name on a deed. Especially when money isn't the obstacle. The first location they checked yielded nothing. Again. Which by now, investigators understood wasn't relief. It was confirmation. Because systems don't fail everywhere. They fail selectively. The second location was a small industrial unit leased under a generic business name. No signage. No employees. No public record of operations. On paper, it was a dead address. In reality, it was anything but. Inside, investigators found something that reframed everything yet again. Not remnants. Not storage. Infrastructure. Clean. Functional. Maintained. This place wasn't abandoned. It was paused. Which raises an unsettling question. Pause for what? Or for whom? The duplicate design. The layout was familiar. Too familiar. Scaled-down versions of the same principles found in the estate. Controlled sightlines. Sound dampening. Segmented spaces. Not as refined. Not as hidden. But unmistakably related. This wasn't coincidence. This was iteration. Like software updates applied to physical space. Each version improved. Each mistake corrected. Each weakness addressed. And then something even more troubling emerged. This location predated the estate. By years. Which meant the estate wasn't the culmination. It was the expansion. The system had outgrown its earlier containers. And needed more. The question of awareness. One of the most uncomfortable questions investigators had to confront was this. How many people knew something was wrong and chose not to act? Because places like this don't exist in a vacuum. Utilities are installed. Repairs are requested. Deliveries are made. Paperwork flows through hands. And yet, nothing had ever triggered a formal inquiry. Why? Because each interaction was isolated. A technician sees odd wiring, but it's not his job to ask why. A landlord notices modifications, but the rent clears. A delivery driver drops off supplies without context. No one sees the whole picture. And systems like this depend on that fragmentation. It's not secrecy. It's diffusion. The son's confidence. During this phase of the investigation, something changed in the son's demeanor. Not panic. Not anger. Confidence. He began speaking more freely. Not about specifics. About ideas. About structure. About how people misunderstand control. At one point, he said something that made the room go quiet. Everyone thinks secrecy is about hiding, he said. It's not. It's about making sure no one looks in the same direction at the same time. That wasn't a slip. That was a philosophy. And it explained everything. Why no single location told the full story. Why evidence was distributed. Why discoveries felt incomplete. The system wasn't designed to be invisible. It was designed to be unassembled. The external clock. As more locations were identified, pressure mounted. Media interest intensified. Questions multiplied. Timelines tightened. And with that pressure came risk. Because systems under scrutiny do one of two things. They shut down, or they accelerate. Investigators worried they were dealing with the latter. Why? Because patterns indicated anticipation. The son hadn't been caught off guard. He had been prepared. Prepared for discovery. Prepared for exposure. Prepared for this moment. Which meant the real danger wasn't what had already happened. It was what might happen next. The final failsafe. Every system has one. A last mechanism. A contingency. Something that activates when everything else is compromised. Analysts searched desperately for it. They combed through communications, financial records, encrypted files, and eventually, they found something that didn't fit. A sequence of transfers. Small amounts, timed precisely, always to the same destination. A trust, not in his name, not even in a recognizable structure. A legal entity designed to outlive individuals, to persist. Why would someone building a physical system also build a legal one? Unless the system wasn't meant to end with him. Unless it was meant to continue. The chilling. Principles without context. This wasn't someone preserving memories. This was someone codifying methods. Which raises an obvious question. Who was the intended audience? Because you don't write manuals for yourself. You write them for someone else. That's when the investigation crossed another threshold. From individual pathology to potential replication. The ghost network. At first, there was no obvious network. No forum posts. No chat logs. No group messages. Nothing that fit the stereotype. And that's exactly why it worked. The connections weren't direct. They were conceptual. The Sun had embedded his ideas into places people wouldn't suspect. Academic discussions. Theoretical essays. Online debates framed as philosophy, not action. No instructions. No commands. Just normalization. He didn't tell anyone what to do. He taught them how to think. And that's far more dangerous. Because when people believe they arrived at an idea on their own, they defend it more fiercely. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with followers. They were dealing with adopters. The illusion of containment. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to say out loud. Most people assume that once someone is arrested, the threat ends. But that only applies when the threat is personal. When it's ideological, containment becomes illusion. Because ideas don't need freedom to spread. They need attention. And by now, this case had plenty of that. Media coverage exploded. Speculation filled the gaps. And with every headline, the system gained oxygen. Not because people supported it, but because they were exposed to it. Even outrage amplifies. That's the paradox investigators were racing against. How do you stop something without feeding it? How do you dismantle a system without teaching others how it works? The trust revisited. Remember the trust. The quiet legal entity that didn't belong to any obvious person. Analysts followed it carefully this time. Not looking for money, looking for purpose. What they found was unsettling. The trust wasn't accumulating wealth. It was distributing it. In small amounts. To unrelated recipients. Grants, donations, fellowships, always framed as support for research, art, or theoretical work. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious on the surface. But when mapped, the recipients shared something. They were all exploring themes of control, observation, efficiency, optimization. Sound familiar? This wasn't funding crime. It was funding thought, which meant the system didn't need a physical continuation. It already had an intellectual one. The realization that changed strategy. An internal memo captured the turning point. This is not about stopping him. It's about interrupting influence. That single sentence reframed everything. Because you can imprison a person. You can seize property. You can erase records. But interrupting influence? That's a different battlefield entirely. It requires subtlety, restraint, and a willingness to let some questions remain unanswered publicly. Not because they're unimportant, because answering them too loudly would give the wrong people a blueprint. The Sun's final advantage. Throughout all of this, the Sun maintained one final advantage. He never claimed authorship, never took credit, never positioned himself as a leader. He spoke in hypotheticals, abstracts. He framed everything as inquiry, as exploration, as curiosity, and that made him difficult to pin down. Because intent hides well behind questions. Isn't it interesting how systems emerge? Why do people assume control is centralized? What if structure is the real actor? These weren't confessions. They were seeds. And seeds don't need the planter to remain. They just need soil. The countdown begins. As investigators work to quietly dismantle the trust, scrub references, and limit amplification, one final discovery added urgency. There was a schedule, not a date, not a time, a condition, a trigger, a clause buried deep in a legal document. If certain criteria were met, assets would transfer, information would release, not to the public, to selected recipients. Automatically. This wasn't revenge. This was succession. The system had a successor mechanism. And it didn't require the original architect to participate. That's when the clock truly started ticking. The uncomfortable decision. Authorities faced a dilemma with no perfect answer. Move too aggressively and risk activating the trigger. Move too slowly and allow influence to spread unchecked. They chose the only option available: silence, quiet disruption, behind-the-scenes neutralization, letting the public narrative stall while the underlying mechanisms were dismantled piece by piece. Would it be enough? No one knew, because systems designed for longevity rarely have single points of failure. And as Chapter 3 draws to a close, one final truth emerges. This was never about one person. It was about an idea that believed itself efficient, rational, inevitable. And the most dangerous ideas aren't violent. They're logical, because logic convinces people they're doing the right thing. And somewhere, in a place investigators still haven't found, a framework may still be waiting. Not for instructions, not for permission, just for someone who believes they're thinking forward. What if the most dangerous part of a system isn't the action, but the justification? That was the thought echoing through the task force room as Chapter 4 began. Because by now, everyone involved understood something fundamental. This wasn't a chase anymore. It was an interruption. And interruptions don't look dramatic from the outside. They look quiet, procedural, boring, even normalization. That was the word investigators kept returning to as Chapter 4 moved toward its quiet, unsettling conclusion. Because when you strip away the structures, the money, the hidden rooms, and the careful language, what remains is something far more uncomfortable. People had adjusted to odd rules, adjusted to unexplained boundaries, adjusted to behaviors that didn't make sense. Not because they agreed with them, but because adaptation is easier than confrontation. And systems like this don't survive on secrecy alone. They survive on accommodation. The slow return of routine. As official activity around the estate dwindled, something strange happened. Life resumed, not inside the gates, but around them. Neighbors stopped staring. Security patrols shortened their routes. Delivery drivers no longer slowed down when passing the property. The house became just another quiet landmark again. That transition disturbed some investigators more than the discoveries themselves, because it meant the disruption had already faded. And if disruption fades, so does memory, which raised an unsettling question. If this could be normalized once, could it be normalized again? The estate as a case study. Rather than selling the property, authorities made a different choice. They preserved it, not as a monument, not as a warning, as a reference. Architectural analysts documented every alteration. Psychologists mapped behavior to structure. Sociologists examined how authority and silence intersected. The house became a lesson, not in crime, but in compliance. Because every hidden space required someone to not ask a question. Every unexplained instruction required someone to obey. Every ignored anomaly required someone to rationalize. And that realization spread beyond the task force. Quietly. Into training programs. Into policy discussions. Into new standards for oversight. No headlines. No announcements. Just adjustments. Because preventing the next system requires changing the environment it would grow in. The sun's silence deepens. Inside custody, the sun receded further. No appeals to philosophy. No reframing attempts. No rhetorical challenges. Just silence. Some mistook that for defeat. Others recognized it for what it was. Acceptance. Not of guilt. Of outcome. Because for someone who believed in systems, being absorbed by one was a kind of symmetry. He didn't rage against it. Didn't try to dismantle it from within. He studied it. And that observation unsettled those assigned to monitor him. Because watching a system work from the inside can be just as instructive as building one. The question no one wanted to ask. As the case wound down, one question lingered uncomfortably in the background. Not about the sun, not about the house, about everyone else. How many similar systems existed right now? Not criminal, not violent, just quietly exploitative, built on compliance, maintained by diffusion, protected by normalcy. Because once you understand the mechanics, you start seeing them everywhere. In workplaces, in institutions, in online spaces, anywhere responsibility is fragmented and assumptions fill the gaps. That's the real legacy of cases like this. They don't just expose a single failure. They expose a pattern. The final internal review. Months later, an internal review summarized the operation in careful language. Objectives met. Threat contained. Influence disrupted. But one line stood out. Success depended not on force, but on reintroducing friction. Friction That small resistance that forces people to slow down, to question, to reconsider. Without friction, systems glide forward unchecked. With it, they wobble. And sometimes, they fall apart. The garage revisited. Before the estate was fully sealed, one investigator asked to stand in the garage one last time. Alone. No equipment. No colleagues. Just silence. He later described the experience in a private journal. It wasn't the space that scared me. It was how ordinary it felt once you knew what it was for. That's the part we have to remember. Ordinary. That word again. Because extraordinary evil rarely announces itself. It hides behind routine, behind procedure, behind phrases like, "That's just how it's done." The quiet ending. There was no dramatic trial moment. No cinematic confession. No shocking final reveal. The story ended the way most real systems do. With paperwork. With policy changes. With attention drifting elsewhere. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Because it denies us closure. It denies us catharsis. It forces us to sit with ambiguity. The knowledge that this wasn't stopped by heroism. It was stopped by awareness. And awareness is fragile. It requires maintenance. The lesson that lingers. As Chapter 4 closes, the case leaves us with something more uncomfortable than answers. Responsibility. Not the kind assigned after the fact. The kind that exists in real time. The responsibility to question routines. To notice inconsistencies. To resist normalization. Because systems don't need villains to survive. They just need silence. And silence is abundant. As files were archived and teams disbanded, one final note was added to the case summary. Future risk depends on collective vigilance, not individual detection, which is a quiet way of saying this. The next system won't look the same. It won't use the same structures. It won't make the same mistakes. But it will rely on the same human tendencies. Comfort, deference, assumption. And somewhere, someday, another door will exist that isn't meant to be opened. Not because what's behind it is hidden, but because opening it would force too many people to ask why it was there in the first place. Which is exactly why they work. The strategy of quiet removal. The decision to proceed silently wasn't unanimous. Some investigators argued for transparency, for public awareness, for sunlight as a disinfectant. Others pushed back hard, because sunlight also teaches. It teaches structure. It teaches method. It teaches sequence. And this system thrived on sequence. So instead of press conferences, there were audits. Instead of raids, there were reviews. Instead of arrests, there were delays. Every mechanism the system depended on was examined not to destroy it, but to slow it. Because slowing a system changes behavior. People adapt. They hesitate. They second-guess. Momentum breaks. And momentum was the system's lifeblood. The first disruption. The trust was the obvious starting point. Not seized. Not frozen. Rerouted. A minor compliance review flagged a technicality. Then another. Then another. Disbursement slowed. Paperwork piled up. Questions were asked. Nothing accusatory. Nothing dramatic. Just enough friction to make participation inconvenient. You'd be amazed how many ideas die not because they're wrong, but because they become annoying. Recipients began to disengage. Not because they felt guilty, because they felt uncertain. And uncertainty is poison to ideology. The online footprint begins to blur. Next came the digital layer. Not deletion, dilution. The essays, the discussions, the abstract debates. They weren't removed. They were contextualized. Footnotes added. Counterpoints elevated. Alternative interpretations amplified. The goal wasn't censorship. It was ambiguity. Because certainty fuels belief. Ambiguity dissolves it. If you can make an idea feel unresolved, people stop building on it. They move on. Attention shifts. And systems that rely on attention starve quietly. The sun watches it happen. From inside custody, the sun noticed. Not immediately, but eventually. He asked fewer questions. Then none at all. He stopped offering theories. Stopped correcting assumptions. Stopped engaging. And that withdrawal said everything. Because he recognized the tactic. He had used it himself. Silence as erosion. One investigator noted something chilling. He's not angry, she said. He's disappointed. Disappointed not because he was caught, but because the system was being unmade without spectacle. No martyrdom. No manifesto. No final statement. Just fade. Which is the one ending systems like this can't control. The missing piece. Despite the progress, something still felt unfinished. A gap, a sense that a layer remained untouched. Because systems this complex rarely rely on a single channel. Redundancy had been a theme from the start. So analysts went back to the beginning. Not the estate. Not the garage. The earliest records. The first moves. The period before there were houses designed to contain behavior. And that's when they noticed something they'd previously dismissed as coincidence. A mentor. Not named. Not central. But present. In early correspondence. In academic acknowledgments. In offhand references. Always vague. Always indirect. Someone who didn't teach methods. But validated mindset. The dangerous role of validation. Validation is powerful. More powerful than instruction. Because instruction tells you what to do. Validation tells you who you are. And once someone believes their thinking is special, advanced, misunderstood, they don't need direction. They need opportunity. Investigators began tracing that influence. Carefully, quietly, and what they found unsettled them. The mentor wasn't a conspirator, wasn't a criminal, wasn't even aware of how their ideas had been repurposed. They were an academic, a theorist, someone who explored abstract questions about systems, efficiency, and observation. Ideas meant for classrooms, for debate, for thought experiments. But ideas don't control where they go once released. That realization forced a hard reckoning. This wasn't just about stopping harm. It was about responsibility, the ethics of thought. At what point does an idea become accountable for how it's used? That question divided the team. Some argued that ideas are neutral. Others argued that neutrality is a myth, because systems don't emerge from nothing. They emerge from frameworks that normalize them. In the end, the decision was made not to pursue blame, but to pursue context. The mentor's work wasn't erased. It was reframed. New discussions, new interpretations, new boundaries. Not to accuse, to clarify, because clarity disrupts misuse. The son's final move. As the system continued to erode, one last attempt surfaced. Subtle, desperate, clever. A message intended not for investigators, but for the public. Not explicit, not incriminating. A narrative shift, positioning himself not as an architect, but as a mirror. Someone reflecting societal flaws. Someone exposing blind spots. Someone misunderstood. It was an attempt to reclaim meaning, to transform exposure into commentary. But it failed, because the ground had already shifted. The audience wasn't curious anymore. They were tired. And tired audiences don't elevate complexity. They disengage. The system loses its audience. That's the part no one anticipates. Systems don't collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when they're ignored. When no one wants to listen. When no one wants to argue. When no one wants to carry the idea forward. And slowly, unmistakably, that's what happened. Mentions declined. Discussions stalled. Funding dried up. Not with a bang. With a shrug. The aftermath nobody notices. Months later, the estate stood empty. Not as a crime scene. As a structure without purpose. The hidden spaces were sealed. Not destroyed. Documented. Because forgetting isn't always wise. Some reminders are necessary. The garage door remained closed. Not because of what was inside. Because of what it represented. A lesson about proximity. About assumptions. About how easily systems grow when no one asks why. And somewhere, in a file marked resolved, an investigator wrote a final note. Threat neutralized. Influence disrupted. Residual risk minimal. Not eliminated. Minimal. Because ideas never fully disappear. They wait. They mutate. They look for new hosts. Which is why vigilance doesn't end when a case does. It just becomes quieter. And as Chapter 4 nears its end, we're left with an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous systems don't announce themselves. They blend. They rationalize. They persuade. Until one day, someone opens a door that was never meant to be opened, and realizes too late that the real danger wasn't what was hidden. It was what had been normalized, what happens after vigilance fades. That was the unspoken question hanging over everything as Chapter 5 began. Because the case might have been archived, the estate sealed, the mechanisms disrupted, but human attention has a half-life. And once it decays, patterns don't need to announce themselves. They just return. The long tail of influence. Here's something most people never consider. When a system collapses quietly, it doesn't disappear. It fragments. Pieces drift. Ideas detach from their origin. Methods lose their labels. What remains isn't a blueprint. It's a residue. And residues are dangerous precisely because they feel incomplete, harmless, unfinished. Investigators knew this. That's why the final phase of the operation wasn't enforcement. It was monitoring, not of the sun, of the world he had brushed up against. Academic circles, professional forums, private think tanks, online spaces where abstraction thrives. Because influence doesn't need commands to survive. It just needs permission. The first echo, the first sign came months later, buried deep in an unrelated review. A consultant had proposed a streamlined oversight model for a large institution. The language was clean, professional, forward-looking. But one phrase stood out: diffuse accountability to reduce friction. That phrase froze the analyst reading it. Because it wasn't illegal, wasn't unethical on its face, wasn't even new, but it was familiar, too.